the spring of 1884, Caleb Thorne was a man who measured his life strictly in terms of daylight and labor. He lived in the Dakota Territory, in a region where the plains rolled out like a flat, frozen ocean, completely devoid of trees, shelter, or mercy. Caleb was 36 years old. He had survived Indian raids, grasshopper plagues, and blizzards that buried his cattle alive. He had survived by being ruthlessly, unapologetically efficient. Caleb had no patience for words. Words did not plow the fields. Words did not chop the winter fuel. Words did not pull a breached calf from a dying heifer in the middle of a sleet storm. He was a man who communicated in brief, guttural commands. He expected immediate comprehension and absolute obedience from his horses, his dogs, and his hired men. But his hired men kept quitting. The isolation of the Dakota plains drove them mad. Caleb realized he needed a different kind of labor force. He needed a partner. He needed a wife. He did not want a companion. He did not want a sounding board for his thoughts. He simply wanted another set of hands to manage the sprawling, demanding machinery of his homestead. So he paid a fee to an immigration agency in Chicago, specifying that he wanted a strong, capable woman who was accustomed to hard work. He specifically requested a woman who was quiet. He got exactly what he asked for, but not in the way he intended. 2,000 miles away, Elżbieta Kaminska was stepping off a cramped, disease-ridden steerage deck in New York Harbor. She was 24 years old, fleeing the suffocating poverty and violence of rural Poland. She possessed absolutely nothing but a small canvas sack, the clothes on her back, and a fierce, burning desperation to survive. Elżbieta was not a quiet woman by nature. In her village, she was known for her sharp wit and her quick tongue. But America instantly silenced her. From the moment she stepped off the boat, she was surrounded by a deafening wall of incomprehensible noise. She became a child again, stripped of her intelligence, her humor, and her agency, simply because she could not form the correct sounds. The agency in Chicago processed her like a piece of freight. They pinned a tag to her coat with Caleb's name and a destination in the Dakota Territory. They handed her a train ticket and a small, cheap Polish-English dictionary. She boarded the train, clutching the small book like a talisman, desperately trying to memorize the English words for hello, husband, and thank you. She expected to be able to explain herself. She expected a learning curve. She expected a man who would listen. They met at the train depot in Fargo. It was a bleak, wind-scoured platform surrounded by a sea of mud. Caleb stood by his wagon, his face hidden beneath the brim of a battered Stetson, his heavy canvas coat coated in trail dust. He looked at the tag pinned to Elżbieta's coat. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a polite greeting. He simply pointed to her canvas sack, then pointed to the back of the wagon. "Put it in," Caleb ordered, his voice a low, gravelly bark. Elżbieta froze. She recognized the tone, but not the words. She frantically opened her small dictionary, her hands shaking, the wind tearing at the thin pages. She tried to find the phonetic translation for what he had just said. Caleb's jaw tightened. He did not have time for this. The sky was darkening, and they had a 2-day ride ahead of them. He stepped forward, snatched the canvas sack from her hands with terrifying speed, threw it into the back of the wagon, and pointed to the hard wooden bench at the front. "Sit," he commanded. Elżbieta's face flushed red with humiliation. She looked at the dictionary in her hands. It was completely, utterly useless against the brutal speed of this man's impatience. She closed the book, climbed up onto the bench, and stared straight ahead. The silence between them was not the comfortable silence of two people who understand each other. It was a heavy, suffocating wall of concrete. The first month on the homestead was a psychological battlefield. Caleb was a man in constant motion, and he expected Elżbieta to match his frantic, punishing pace. He would issue rapid, barking orders in English, telling her to fetch a specific wrench, to separate the milk, to tie a specific knot on a harness. Elżbieta would stare at him, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She was an incredibly intelligent woman, but she was trapped behind a locked door. When she brought him the wrong tool, Caleb would let out a sharp hiss of frustration, snatch the tool from her hand, and storm off to do it himself. He never hit her. He was not a violent man, but his sheer, unapologetic impatience was a weapon all its own. It made her feel stupid. It made her feel useless. A Swedish immigrant pioneer named Mina Olin, who settled in a similar environment, wrote a letter back to her sister in Europe that perfectly captured this specific agony. She wrote, "To be without the language in this harsh country is to be a ghost in your own home. You can see the work that needs to be done, You can feel the anger of the people around you, but you cannot speak to defend yourself. You are judged entirely by your mistakes because you have no words to explain your intentions. Elżbieta was living as a ghost, but ghosts on the frontier do not survive, and Elżbieta Kaminska was a survivor. One evening in late May, the tension finally snapped. Caleb was exhausted. A late spring frost was threatening his newly planted wheat. He rushed into the cabin, covered in mud, and began frantically searching for a heavy canvas tarp he needed to cover the seed bags in the barn. He had asked Elżbieta to mend it earlier that day. He couldn't find it. He turned to her, his face dark with stress. "Where's the tarp?" "The heavy canvas." "I told you to mend the canvas," he shouted, gesturing wildly with his hands. Elżbieta had not mended the tarp. She had misunderstood his gesture that morning. She had spent 5 hours meticulously washing and boiling all of his heavy winter woolens. A backbreaking task she thought would please him. She looked at him, realizing her mistake. She tried to point to the clean woolens drying by the stove. Caleb didn't look. He just let out a roar of absolute frustration, grabbed his hat, and kicked a wooden bucket across the room. The bucket smashed into the wall, shattering into pieces. He turned toward the door, muttering under his breath about the uselessness of the agency, the stupidity of the situation, the absolute waste of time. He expected her to shrink away. He expected her to cry. She did not. Elżbieta's fear vanished, replaced instantly by a blinding white-hot fury. She had crossed an ocean. She had endured the humiliation of the steerage deck. She had worked her fingers to the bone in this miserable, wind-torn cabin for 30 days. She refused to be treated like a disobedient dog. She slammed her hand down on the heavy wooden table. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the small cabin. Caleb stopped. He turned around, shocked. Elżbieta marched right up to him. She was 8 inches shorter than him, but in that moment she seemed to take up the entire room. She looked him dead in the eye, raised her voice, and unleashed a torrential, furious stream of Polish. She yelled at him for his impatience. She yelled at him for treating her like a machine. She pointed to the clean woolens, then pointed to her blistered red hands. She didn't use a single word of English. She used the raw, undeniable tone of human rage and absolute demand for respect. She finished her tirade, chest heaving, staring up at him with eyes that dared him to kick another bucket. Then, she reached into her apron pocket, pulled out the small, cheap Polish-English dictionary the agency had given her, and threw it directly into the burning iron stove. Caleb watched the book land on the coals. He watched the pages curl and burst into flames. He looked back at Elżbieta. He didn't understand a single word she had just said, but he understood the message perfectly. She was not a machine. She was not stupid, and she would not be broken. For the first time since she had arrived, Caleb Thorne truly saw the woman standing in his cabin. He saw the fierce, unyielding spine of a survivor. He realized with a sudden, sharp pang of shame that his impatience was not a virtue. It was a failure of leadership. He looked at her red, blistered hands. He looked at the meticulously clean woolens by the stove. He slowly took off his hat. He didn't speak. He simply gave a short, tight nod of acknowledgement. An apology, delivered in the only language he was comfortable with, silence. The next morning, the dynamic on the homestead fundamentally shifted. The language barrier was still absolute, but the method of communication changed. Caleb stopped barking orders. He realized that if he wanted speed, he had to provide clarity. When they were repairing a fence line, he didn't just point and shout. He walked over to her, placed the heavy iron wire stretchers in her hands, and physically guided her grip. He showed her the tension. He let her feel the mechanical advantage of the tool. Elżbieta, no longer paralyzed by the fear of his anger, revealed her true capability. Her mind was a steel trap. She watched his movements with the predatory focus of a hawk. She learned the rhythm of his labor. They began to build a micro-language, a vocabulary composed entirely of grunts, nods, whistles, and the physical choreography of hard labor. 2 short taps on the wagon wheel meant to engage the brake. A sharp whistle meant to drop the reins. A heavy sigh from Caleb meant the soil was too wet to plow. A sharp click of Elżbieta's tongue meant the soup was too hot to eat. They became a flawless, silent machine. They could butcher a hog in 2 hours without exchanging a single spoken word, their knives moving in perfect, bloody synchronization. They could harness a team of 6 draft horses in the dark, communicating only through the clinking of chains and the slap of leather. They didn't have romantic conversations by the fire. They didn't share their childhood memories. They shared the weight of a 100-pound grain sack. They shared the brutal, freezing wind. They shared survival. The ultimate test of their silent bond arrived in late August of 1885. It had been a brutally dry summer. The prairie grass was baked to a crisp, pale yellow, brittle as glass. The air was thick, hot, and smelled of dust. Caleb was 3 miles from the cabin, cutting hay in the lower pasture. Elżbieta was near the barn, rendering lard in a massive iron cauldron over an open fire. Suddenly, the wind shifted. It didn't just change direction. It accelerated, howling in from the southwest with terrifying violence. Elżbieta looked up. On the horizon, the sky was not blue. It was a bruised, terrifying purple, bleeding into a thick, rolling wall of pitch black, a dry lightning storm. Before she could even shout a warning to the empty yard, a massive bolt of lightning struck the ridge a mile away. The dry grass exploded. Driven by the howling wind, the fire did not spread. It sprinted. A wall of orange flame, 30 feet high, began racing directly toward the homestead. Elżbieta didn't panic. She didn't freeze. The silent language she had built with Caleb over the last 4 months took over. She knew exactly what Caleb would do, and she knew exactly what he needed her to do. Caleb saw the smoke from the lower pasture. He dropped his scythe, cut one of his draft horses free from the harness, leaped onto its bare back, and rode toward the cabin like a madman. He knew the fire was moving too fast. He knew he couldn't beat it. He needed Elżbieta to prepare the defense before he even got there. When Caleb finally galloped into the yard, his horse lathered in sweat. The roar of the approaching fire was deafening. It sounded like a freight train. The air was thick with choking, black smoke and raining white ash. He leaped off the horse, ready to frantically gesture, ready to yell commands over the roar of the flames. He didn't have to. Elżbieta had already done it all. She had released the livestock from the barn, driving them into the plowed dirt of the vegetable garden, where there was no fuel for the fire. She had dragged heavy, woolen blankets from the cabin and submerged them in the large horse trough, soaking them completely. She had filled every bucket, every pot, and every cast iron pan with water. She stood in the middle of the yard, her face covered in soot, her dress tied up above her knees, holding a soaking wet, heavy wool blanket in her hands. She looked at Caleb as he ran into the yard. She didn't ask what to do. She simply threw him the other end of the heavy, wet blanket. He caught it. Their eyes met through the smoke. Absolute, perfect synchronization. The fire hit the edge of the property line. The heat was a physical blow, singeing the hair on their arms. Embers the size of fists rained down on the dry wooden roof of the barn and the cabin. For 2 agonizing hours, they fought a desperate, silent war in the smoke. They didn't speak. They couldn't hear each other even if they tried. They moved as a single organism. When an ember ignited the roof of the barn, Caleb was already climbing the ladder, and Elżbieta was already handing up a bucket of water. When a patch of dry grass near the cabin caught fire, they swung the heavy, wet blankets in perfect unison, smothering the flames with brutal, rhythmic force. They anticipated each other's movements. They covered each other's blind spots. They trusted each other with their lives, communicating entirely through the shared, desperate choreography of survival. When the wind finally broke and the main front of the fire roared past them, leaving a blackened, smoking wasteland in its wake, they collapsed. The homestead was saved. The barn was scorched. The cabin was blackened, but they were standing. Caleb fell to his knees in the dirt yard, gasping for air, his lungs burning from the smoke. His hands were blistered, his clothes were singed, and his face was completely black with soot. Elżbieta collapsed a few feet away, leaning against the heavy wooden wheel of the wagon. She was exhausted to her very bones, her hair wildly tangled, her hands bleeding. The roar of the fire had passed, replaced by a profound, ringing silence. Caleb slowly lifted his head. He looked at the scorched earth. He looked at the surviving barn, and then he looked at the woman leaning against the wagon wheel. He had ordered a quiet worker. He had received a warrior. He realized that all the words he had ever spoken in his life, all the commands he had barked at hired men, all the impatient demands he had made, were entirely meaningless compared to what this woman had just done in absolute silence. He dragged himself across the dirt. He didn't stand up. He crawled until he was sitting next to her, leaning his back against the same wagon wheel. They sat there, shoulder to shoulder, staring at the smoking ruins of the prairie. Caleb reached over. His large, blistered, soot-covered hand gently found hers. He laced his fingers through hers, gripping her hand tightly. Elżbieta didn't pull away. She squeezed back, resting her head against his shoulder. Caleb closed his eyes. His throat was raw from the smoke, but he forced his vocal cords to work. He didn't bark. He didn't command. He spoke very softly. Dziękuję. Elżbieta's eyes snapped open. She turned her head, looking at him in absolute shock. Thank you, in Polish. He had a terrible accent. His pronunciation was jagged and clumsy, but the word was unmistakable. Caleb opened his eyes and met her gaze. He had found the burned remnants of her small dictionary in the ashes of the stove months ago. He had salvaged the partially burned pages. He had spent the last 3 months sitting in the barn by the light of a lantern, painstakingly trying to memorize the few words he could decipher. He hadn't done it because he wanted to chat. He had done it because he wanted to earn the right to speak to her. Elżbieta stared at him, tears cutting clean tracks through the thick soot on her face. A slow, exhausted, beautiful smile broke across her face. She squeezed his hand, leaned her head back against his shoulder, and closed her eyes. "You're welcome," Elżbieta whispered. In perfect, crystal-clear English, they sat in the ashes, holding hands, having finally found the only words that actually mattered. We place so much value on our ability to communicate effortlessly. We believe that if we can just find the right words, we can solve any problem, fix any relationship, and bridge any gap. But Caleb and Elżbieta discovered the ultimate, raw truth of human connection. Words are just the decoration. True intimacy is not built in the easy, flowing conversations of a comfortable life. True intimacy is built in the fire. It is built in the terrifying moments when the words run out, and all you have left is the absolute certainty that the person standing next to you will not drop their end of the blanket. You don't need to speak the same language to survive together. You just have to be willing to bleed for the same ground. If this story made you reflect on the way we communicate today, I have a question for you. Think deeply about it before you answer. What was the exact moment you realized Caleb and Elżbieta were going to make it? Was it the moment she threw the dictionary in the fire, or the moment they fought the flames together? Leave a comment down below and share your thoughts. Sometimes the most profound conversations happen right there in the comments. Let's talk about it.